Hi, Budget Harley Quinn is here today to review Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. So, first of all, don't be like me and get the three-pack of her first three books because while Interview with the Vampire isn't that long, her other two books, so The Vampire Lestat and The Queen of the Damned, are really big. And so this thing is really heavy. I think it weighs a couple pounds. And I was sitting there trying to read it like a regular book, holding it up with my arms, and I always had to just put my legs up and be like, all right, I gotta rest this on something. It's very heavy. So if you're gonna read these, try to get the individual books or the ebooks because that's gonna make it a lot easier. So as usual, first I want to go into what happened in the book, and then I'll go over my thoughts. Of course, there will be spoilers, but this book is over 43 years old. Yeah, I didn't realize it was quite that old. I knew it was older, but I didn't realize how old it was. So let's get into what happens in the book. So basically, it starts out with this vampire and this younger guy meeting, I think either at a hotel or just someplace. They're meeting up. And the young guy is basically, I'm not entirely sure what his project is, but he's trying to do profiles on really interesting people. And he says, I don't know how long I'll be interested in listening to you because I need to get a lot of people's interesting stories. And the vampire's just like, all right, don't worry. You're not going to need to interview anybody else. It's okay. And so the entire book is actually told in dialogue. It's essentially a first-person novel, but it's all in dialogue. Like, when it comes out of the dialogue, it's just in, like, omniscient, third-person omniscient, but that doesn't happen super often. Also, there are no chapters in this book. There are some, like, chapter breaks, maybe, like they skip a couple lines. But even that's not super often. And they also break it up into 4 parts. But the first part is really big, and then the other 3 parts are like a lot smaller. So it can make it a little difficult to read. So just know that when you go into it, that it's formatted very strangely. Like it's very, very odd. So anyway, the vampire then starts to tell the young guy his story. He was born in France, and then his family moved to New Orleans in the 1700s. I think like the mid to late 1700s, something like that. And he talks about his family and that his brother, he always kind of regretted how he handled his brother because his brother basically became super religious and crazy and might wind up killing himself. And Louis always blamed himself. Louis is the name of the vampire. It's probably pronounced Louis because he's French, but I'm just going to pronounce it Louis. So Louis always felt really bad about that, but, whatever. And he's going through his life like normal. And then he gets attacked by a vampire. And this vampire turns Louis into a vampire for the sole reason that Louis is a very wealthy landowner. He has a plantation. He has lots of money. And he wants what Louis has. And this vampire's name is Lestat. And Lestat is the name that you most associate with this whole series. I think he's like the main character for the rest of the series. He doesn't come off very well in this series, so I'm guessing they retcon his character in the other books, because in this book he is horrible. And kind of like one of the main plot points is that he's horrible. But anyway, Lestat wants Louis's money and his big house and plantation and all that to take care of his elderly father. At this point, Lestat's father is still alive, so Lestat has not been a vampire for super, super long. And so for several years, they basically just go on doing their thing. They try not to see the family except in like low light and make excuses why they can't attend weddings and funerals and things like that. And then eventually, Lestat's father dies. And also the slaves start to figure out that Louis and Lestat are not human. And so I don't remember if it's the vampires or one of the slaves, but somehow the plantation gets set on fire. The whole house gets set on fire. And then they have to move to New Orleans because Louis has a townhouse there. Before that, they stay with this woman that Louis has kind of been stalking. And he had given her good advice years ago, and so she kind of is like, okay, mysterious person, you can stay in the cellar. And then she figures out he's a vampire, and she freaks out, and she basically goes mad, and it's weird, and I don't know why it's in there, but whatever. To torture Louis, because I think the whole point of this book is that Louis is tortured, and it's annoying, and whatever. I'll get into that in my review. But they eventually move into a townhouse in New Orleans. They live there for a while, just kind of doing their thing. They don't really say, like, what they do. They just kind of go and they hunt and all that. And a big thing to note is that Louis, for some reason, he really doesn't like killing people. And that's kind of like part of the vampire's nature is that they're supposed to kill people. But, so he tries to kill more animals and stuff. And he does kill a few people, but he doesn't really enjoy it. And Lestat really revels in it and is kind of a dick and won't tell Louis about any other vampires or like what their limits are. And so Louis, as much as he wants to leave Lestat because he doesn't like Lestat, he also doesn't know what his limits are, what his weaknesses are as a vampire because Lestat won't tell him. And Lestat always gets really mad when Louis brings it up. So Louis is just like, okay, whatever, I guess I gotta stay with Lestat because I don't really have a choice. Well, it gets to a breaking point where Louis is really close to leaving Lestat, and Louis is wandering the streets, and he hears a girl crying, and he looks in, and a plague had been kind of going through New Orleans at this point. And he finds a young girl, she's like 5 years old, crying, and her mother is dead and has been dead for at least a few days. And for whatever reason, I think it's just because Louis is hungry and he kind of feels pity for her, he feeds on her. He feeds on the little girl. But he doesn't kill her, and he I don't know if he has somebody find her, but she's found and taken to like an orphanage. And then Lestat decides to pretend to be the girl's father and brings her to Louis. And says, you know, you started it, you need to finish it. You can't leave her alive. And so Louis is really upset about this, but says, okay, fine, I will finish the job. And he's about to finish, feeding on her and killing her. And Lestat rips her away and then turns her into a vampire by basically feeding her his blood. And you can imagine this presents all sorts of problems. She's 5 years old and she's a vampire. And so it talks about, Louis essentially becomes a father to her. Her name is Claudia. And he basically becomes a father to her. And she's very, very smart. And she's really, but she's also really upset. 'Cause she's like, I can't be anything but a little girl. Like if you had waited even a few more years to turn me, things might have been different. And she really, really resents Lestat for doing this, and is the one who comes up with the plan that says, hey, we need to leave Lestat, and we need to kill him, because otherwise he'll come find us. And Louis doesn't like this. Louis just wants to leave and not kill Lestat. Louis is I have issues with Louis, and again, we'll go into that, but, he just kind of, he doesn't expect Claudia to go through with it. And one day, one evening, Lestat comes back home And at this point, I think they're in the 1800s or 1900s or something. They're a little loosey-goosey with the timeline as far as what time period things are happening. By the end of the book, they're in the 70s, in the 1970s, but they're either in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, something like that. I don't really know exactly what time period they're in, but anyway. She comes back, or Lestat comes back one evening. Claudia says, "Oh, I have a present for you," and she has basically thralled two young boys, and she says, "Here, one for you, one for me." And Lestat drinks from one of them, and it turns out he has been heavily dosed with alcohol. Vampires get drunk if the person they drink is drunk. And the boy that he drank had been heavily dosed with alcohol, and it turns out the other boy actually died from alcohol poisoning. And so since Lestat is super drunk, it gives Claudia the opportunity to basically slit his throat and cut him and then drain him of his blood, and he becomes just an emaciated looking corpse. And they think he's dead. And so they go and they get rid of the boys' bodies, and they put Lestat deep in, I think, the water, like deep under the dirt or the water or something. And, it's like, oh, hey, it's all hunky-dory. Until it isn't, because Lestat is still alive, and Lestat recovers, although he's kind of scarred and all that. But he comes back, and then there's a fight at the townhouse, and they set it on fire, and they're like, okay, now he should be dead because we set him on fire, or this set the house that he was in on fire. But Louis doesn't think Lestat's dead. Louis is like, no, I have a feeling that he's not dead. And fortunately, right before the fire, they had been actually planning a trip to Europe, basically to go live in Europe. They want to find more vampires like them. They don't know really anything about themselves as far as, vampires go. And so they go to Europe, and they are looking around different villages and things, and they get closer and closer to, I think, like Transylvania and Bulgaria and all those places. And they come across a town that has been basically terrorized by a vampire. And Louis and Claudia go to look for this vampire. They've kind of heard where it's from. And they find the vampire, but this vampire it looks like a corpse, and he's completely crazed and will not listen to them. And so they wind up having to kill this vampire. It turns out that these vampires are called revenants. They're sort of an old school version of a vampire. They are mindless, and they do vampire things, but they're mindless. They don't act civilized or anything like that. And so they decide, after finding several more of these revenants, that let's go to Paris. Louis, is French, and I think he was born in Paris or something, and Claudia's like, yeah, I just want to be among my own people. They both speak French and all that. And they go to Paris, and lo and behold, they are being followed by some vampires, and are eventually invited to go to this essentially vampire theater, where a bunch of vampires have gathered in a sort of like nest family thing, and they perform plays that are essentially them killing a person on stage, and the audience doesn't know. And the guy he says he is not technically their leader, but everyone respects him. His name is Armand, and he has the hots for Louis. And Louis apparently has the hots for him, and it is so stupid how fast this happens, but it happens. And Armand does not like Claudia, because Claudia is, she's trapped in the body of a little girl, and she's very erratic and strange and all that. And Armand does not believe that Claudia will let Louis go, so he doesn't like her. And the rest of his group, the rest of the other vampires, are very suspicious of them, because they have heard that Lestat, or that they have killed Lestat, and it's a crime to kill another vampire, unless I think like in self-defense or something. But so they're very, very wary. And so then, in order for Claudia to basically let go of Louis, Claudia asks him to create her another parent. And Claudia finds this doll maker named Madeline, who had lost her own child and is in grief, and she wants another child to take care of. And so Louis very, very reluctantly makes Madeline into a vampire. And it turns out that Armand sort of influenced Louis to do this because he knew it was the only way that Claudia would let Louis go. And it turns out Madeline is crazy, but Madeline cares about Claudia, so it's okay. And Armand tells Louis, they need to leave Paris, otherwise the other group, all the rest of the group, they still think that, Claudia is very strange and they want to kill her because of what she did to Lestat. But they say, okay, you need to leave Paris or you're going to have problems. Well, before they get to leave, Lestat comes back, of course, and tells them what happened. It's like, I need Louis to come back with me. It was only Claudia who attacked me and all that. And they wind up sealing Louis in a coffin and bricking up around it. And Armand helps Louis get out of it, but when they get back upstairs or wherever they're supposed to go, they find that Claudia and Madeline have been set on fire and are dead. dead. Louis is pissed about this, of course, because Claudia has basically been his daughter for like 2 centuries, and so he's pissed. And so he tells Armand, don't be here. Don't stay here anymore. And Louis comes back during the day, or not during the day, but like right before daylight, and sets the entire place on fire, and everybody dies except for Armand, and as we found out later, Lestat also does not die because he left. And so then it's Armand and Louis, and now they can be in love and travel the world, and they do travel the world. They go to Egypt and some other places. And they eventually go back to New Orleans because they hear that Lestat's there. And it turns out Louis has basically become completely numb to everything. He has no passions at all, and Armand is really tired of it. And Armand is hoping that maybe seeing Lestat again will give him some more passion. It doesn't. Louis finds that Lestat has basically become a shell of himself. He's only eating animals, and he had made another vampire to help him, but that vampire's fed up with him and winds up leaving him. But Lestat is very sad. He's just in this old, dirty place, and he's just eating animals. And Louis is like, yeah, okay, I saw you. I have closure. I don't care about you anymore. Bye. And Armand's like, yeah, I'm leaving you too, Louis, because you have no passion for anything. You saw him and you did nothing, so bye. And that's basically how it ends, or that's how Louis ends his story to the boy, or the young man who is recording him. And then the young man's like, turn me into a vampire. I want to do that. He's like, Louis is like, did you not hear any of my story? How it's kind of horrible to be a vampire? I want to be a vampire. And so he's like, well, I'll show you maybe some of it. And so he feeds on the man, but doesn't kill him. And the man wakes up in the morning and he remembers kind of a location where Louis said Lestat was, because this is around the same time period. And so it's implied that the young man is going to go find Lestat and interview him and try to become a vampire. And that's how it ends. So let's go into what I thought about this. So I want to say, first of all, I did not like this book at all. And I think a big part of that is because there have been so many more vampire novels and media and all that sort of stuff in the last, 10, 15 years. And this came out in 1976. And so this was probably revolutionary at the time. Like, it was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And it's like, ooh, there's guys loving each other, but it's not explicit at all. It's super, subtle with a lot of that. And so, but of course I was like, ooh, this is good. This is spicy. Ho ho. And ooh, vampires, getting a different, take on it and all that, beyond just, ooh, I'm a big monster. And so I think at the time, it was a big deal, but it does not hold up well today. And I mean, if you like this novel, that's fine, and maybe some of the other books get better, but the only thing I could think of while I was reading this was that Lewis is such a bitch-ass vampire that I want to smack him. The entire book, he just hated the fact that he was a vampire, and it was so passive about so many of the things that happened to him. He wanted to listen to either what Claudia wanted, or Lestat wanted, or what Armand wanted. He didn't really do anything he wanted until he set, like, the vampire people on fire. That was, like, the one thing that he really did for himself. And that was basically it. Everything else, he was just kind of going along with what everybody else wanted. And it bothered me so much. He had no agency of his own. And maybe that was the point. But oh, he was so annoying. I didn't care what happened to him. I was just like, all right, as much of an asshole as Lestat is, I was interested more in him just because I knew that he was going to be more of the main character in the other books. But Lestat was not developed really at all in this. It was very hinted at that when he had been turned, he was basically used kind of as a slave. And he didn't like that, and so he left, or I don't know what he did to his master. Who knows? I'm sure that'll be explained. The next book is about Lestat and his story, and I'm sure more of them are too. But you didn't really get into him that much, and they skipped huge chunks of time where they didn't explain what the time period exactly was. You only kind of knew the exact time period at the end of the novel because you're like, okay, it's obviously in the, mid to late 1900s. But otherwise I was going, I don't really know what time period this is. I don't really know what I'm supposed to expect the clothing to look like. There wasn't a whole lot of that. And it was so focused on sort of the internal struggles in the psychology of what was going on rather than actual events. I would say the majority of this novel was exploring how Lewis felt about certain things versus actual things happening. Lewis is always saying, oh, well, of course I have to feel about this like this because of reasons and things, and he did that like 50 million times. And it got really old. And then of course they had Claudia, who is a little 5-year-old vampire. And I like at least some of the things they did with her, but again, she was the one who would tell Lewis what to do, and Lewis was just like, okay, whatever, I just want to please her. Like, Lewis, grow some balls. Do something. Please. Just don't be so passive in your own damn story. Oh, he bothered me so much. So, yeah, I didn't really know what to expect going into this. Like I said, I cheated a little bit because I had read, I think I only read 20 pages years ago when I started this. So I didn't really know what to expect going in because I didn't remember really anything. And then I was reading it, and I can't see myself reading the other ones because it's kind of a similar writing style where it's sort of an autobiographical type thing. And I'm worried that she keeps with sort of the psychological stuff rather than the actual action. Because let's face it, nowadays, in all, the landscape of all the media we have with vampires, there's a lot more stuff, a lot more explicit stuff, if we want, the sexy stuff, or action-y stuff. And there's even a lot of good psychological stuff, too, that's out there. And it's a lot more accessible and a lot more interesting than this. And I can definitely see that this was a big influence on the current landscape, or at least the landscape 10 years ago and going into today. But it is not good anymore. And that is something that happens when the times change. I mean, this is over 4 decades old. So when that happens, times change, and what used to be revolutionary and really cool and good and interesting suddenly seems really lame. And it's unfortunate because, again, I think that at the time this was probably just a big deal. Because you can imagine in the 70s, reading about vampires and this type of stuff, and the fact that it's, two men falling in love and all that. That was probably like, ooh, that's a big no-no. And again, I don't even think they kissed. It was very not explicit. It was all innuendo, basically, for even their love. They said they love each other, but that's about it. But that's, that was probably a really big deal. And now it's like, I was just like, all right, when are you gonna bone? Oh, wait, that's not that type of novel. I felt really bad. Because like, you hear, like, oh, these are so, like, deep and sexy. And like, I'm reading this going, this isn't deep and sexy. I mean, maybe the other ones are, because the other ones were written, The Vampire Lestat was written in 85, and then Queen of the Damned was written in 88. So maybe those go a little bit further into what I was expecting. But no, there's more violence than there is sex, and there's no real sex. It's like super, I mean, there's not even really any implied sex. It's just kind of, they say that the best, like, sort of sexual pleasure a vampire gets is from the kill. So they don't really talk about actual sex. So it's really, really strange. I don't know. Again, in this landscape, I've read so many different things with vampires and watched stuff. Like, you watch True Blood and it's like they're banging all the time. It's just different. So it's hard to say if I would recommend this or not. I don't know. It would really depend on if the other books are good or not. I would almost suggest that if you can, skip Interview with the Vampire and go straight to The Vampire Lestat. All I gotta know is that, pretty much what I told you, Lestat's kind of a dick, and they tried to kill him, and he came back. That's kind of all you really need to know. I have so many thoughts about this book, and mostly they're very underwhelming. It's a very underwhelming book. So yeah, so that's kind of my review of Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Very disappointing, and it's not the book's fault. It was written so many years ago that trying to live up to the hype of nowadays, all the stuff we have with vampires, it wasn't going to do it. It just couldn't. Like, the landscape 40 plus years ago was very different than it is today. So she couldn't probably get away with some of the stuff that she may have wanted to. So I understand that. But I don't think that modern readers of vampire literature are going to enjoy it. I just don't. But that's just my opinion. You may want to pick it up. It's not hard to read, and it's not very long. It's 340 pages. Well, at least in trade paperback. It might be a bit longer in mass market. But it's not super long. It's a little weird in the way it's structured because there's no chapters. And it's interesting, but ultimately you just kind of want to smack Lewis because he's such a bitch. I hate saying that, but he has no agency. He does like one thing for himself. And that's about it. And that's why I don't like him. And it's really hard to want to read a story when you don't like the protagonist. And then the next book is the protagonist is the guy who you don't like at all either in this book. I didn't really like any of the characters. And when that happens, it's kind of hard to want to read more of them. And so, yeah, it's It's a classic book nowadays, and I don't know how to feel about that. I don't like it. I honestly can't really recommend it unless you're diehard into, seeing some of the earlier vampire novels and all that. Again, it's not hard to read, but it's not very good either. Not anymore. But yeah, so those are my thoughts and my opinions on Interview with the Vampire. I am really disappointed. I thought it was going to be a lot better than it was. And I bought this years ago, this huge giant thing. And of course I bought this because it was a lot cheaper to get this than to get 3 separate books, because this was $20 at the time. This would probably be like 25 or 30 nowadays, something like this big. Don't do it. Get the individual books or get the ebooks or something, because this is heavy. It's like reading, whenever I have to read A Dance with Dragons by George R. R. Martin, that book is heavier than this because actually, this has more pages in it, but Dance with Dragons is really big and it's a hardcover. And I'm like, oh god, I can't hold it up. Do yourself a favor and get the individual books. Don't buy the 3 packs of these because they're hard to read. But yeah, so that was my review. I hope you enjoyed Budget Harley Quinn. One side of my hair is longer than the other because I normally don't part it in the middle. And it looks, oh god, it looks so bad, and I'm so sorry. But I will be doing one more costume for the last book review in October. It's gonna be very lazy. It'll be funny, it'll be good, but it'll be also kind of lazy. But yeah, so thank you for watching. If you want to see what I am currently reading, for the hashtag 1 year of books, you can go ahead and follow me on Twitter at author M.E. Kennedy, or you can just check me out. And I'll also be posting like random videos on Fridays. For this upcoming Friday, of course, I will be reading one of my terrible old stories. It'll probably be the last one in October. And then I may do those occasionally in the future. But I don't have an infinite number of old stories, so I have to like dole them out carefully, and I don't think that many people watch it, so that's okay. But yeah, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you later. Bye.